Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today I'm going to be discussing the format rotation and essentially the world's format. That's what a lot of people already have on their minds. They're already starting to look towards the future. Of course, there's still a few regionals left, as well as a NAIC as well. Probably the biggest tournament of the year. But there's a lot of people whose seasons are starting to wind down. You've already got your invite and you're starting to look towards the new set and what Worlds is going to be like. Of course, we have the combination of a format rotation as well as a new set coming out. So I'm going to be trying to tackle both those topics a little bit today and try and sort of get a map going of where we need to start testing. So for the contents today, we're going to have a quick overview of the cards that we lose. I mean, most people know what's gone at this point. We'll have a quick summary about that, a breakdown of those pre-rotation survivors. So the decks that are currently good and if they're able to survive once all these cards go from, Sun and Moon up to Crimson Invasion. We'll start talking a little bit about Unified Minds and the biggest introductions from that set that we have to discuss. Then I'll be talking about this sort of Worlds meta that I'm basically having as a long list of decks. I think it's 14 decks that will inevitably get shorter as testing starts coming into play or whatnot. But I think these are decks that I currently have on my radar and at least want to build theorycraft lists of and get some games in with them, just to know that I haven't left any stone unturned. That's the idea. And I'll be discussing why I believe those are potential decks that we could be looking for Worlds. So, starting off, let's have a quick little look at some of these most important cards that are being rotated. You can see on the bottom here, these are the most impactful ones. Zoroark, of course, being a huge card leaving our format. Lycanroc as well, a key gusting Pokemon. Tapu Koko, played in, Pika-Rom, Zapdos, and even things like Turbo Rayquaza and Vika Ray is a big option to knock out some tag teams. Lele, of course, is one of the biggest ones as well. Wonder tagging was such a vital piece of many people's decks for consistency, alongside like Ultra Ball and whatnot. Oranguru, nice for instructing, protecting you against going down to a low hand size and giving you a few extra cards here and there. Energy Evolution Eevee, great for all those stage 1s, so they were effectively cheating versions of basics. That's no longer available, although we do still keep some of our evolutions. They all seem a lot slower now. Alolan Muck was the only real form of ability lock we had in the format outside of Glaceon, which does still stay. So having Power of Alchemy is, or no longer have to worrying about Power of Alchemy is good for some of these basics with abilities. Hooper, that very annoying wall Pokemon, is finally leaving us. And Let Loose Marshmallow, I'm sure a lot of people are overjoicing about this card finally rotating. It's not been around for long, but it's definitely been impactful, and that's also going to be leaving us. So we don't have to worry about starting the game with a 5-card hand size instead of a 7, so that's always great for us. Also, let's have a look at the trainer cards that we're losing from the set. DCE being obviously probably the most impactful alongside like Guzma and Acerola. Like, these are really, really impactful cards. DCE was the cornerstone of not only Zoroark, but a bunch of other decks, and closing the door on a lot of different cards for not having this easy one attachment to supplement their attack cost is a really big deal. Acerola and Max Potion both going, removes all the healing really that we have. We're left with like mixed herbs and the new Great Potion that we get from the set, which are far inferior options to Acerola and Max Potion, which were very heavily used. Guzma, the best gusting option we have. We even lose Rope and Counter Catcher. And again, that Lycanroc GX that you saw on the last slide, that means that gusting is few and far between now. We are limited to custom catchers, a combination of finding both of them at once to pick a target to be a Lysander effect effectively. And also we have the 9 Temptations Ninetales, which can discard 2 fire from your hand to choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and bring it up into the active. So we really don't have much Gust remaining. Stretcher, Ultra Ball, Nest Ball, these were, again, lifeblood cards that you saw in a huge array of decks just to get searching. And I think that's going to be the thing that you feel most about the rotation. Ball search is very limited now, so that's something to bear in mind. We can't easily just get any deck rolling with a combination of 4 Nest, 4 Ultra, and a couple of Rescue Stretcher to maintain attackers throughout the game. Choice Band and Kukui as well, these are big ones. Damage modifiers are always important for hitting key numbers, and those are also leaving us, as well as a few very impactful supporter cards and stadiums and whatnot as well. Pause if you want to have a closer look at these in more detail, but I'm going to be going over the overview now and talk about these things really in general here. So here are the keynotes from rotation. limited ball search and recovery. That means that there'll only be a handful of decks that can actually get things rolling in the first place. And that's obviously what every deck needs to do. Get their Pokemon out to start doing, cool abilities, or get your attackers down to start attaching to them and all that good stuff. There's only a handful of decks that can actually do that very effectively anymore. We have things like Ultra Space, we have Mysterious Treasure, we have Netball, and then we have like Pokecom and Elm, a Pokemon Fan Club. We have Electromagnetic Radar. We have the new Cherish Ball coming out. So it's a lot less than we're used to, essentially. And it's more limited to what we expect. So that's already going to have a real impact on the amount of decks that can actually function in the first place. We also lose all the control/denial tools, or the majority of them at least. I think the healing is already like the biggest one. Acerola and Max Potion leaving, meaning that any sort of like chip damage on Pokemon trying to stall will just not leave the field anymore. So these sorts of Lusamine loop-based decks, I believe, will be no longer a factor in the format because they can't undo the damage that you're trying to put on them with all your pressure. So the sort of tanking sort of opportunities that they have are just much less now, which is amazing for you. Gusting effects, as said before, that's the biggest one. Your bench is a lot more safer now throughout the entire game, which is crazy. It means you can try and build up big attackers. You can put down Dedenes more freely to draw cards and not worry about the ramifications quite as much. And there'll only be a handful of decks playing Gust. I don't think every deck will be playing Gust in the new format, which is very rare to say, but the Gusting options are quite limited. The custom catchers or the Ninetales are the only ways, and it's not always easy to accumulate custom catchers, especially if you don't have a good draw engine. Things like a Persian GX or a lower Ninetales GX could help you accumulate these custom catchers on key turns. But if you're not playing those cards, I mean, it might be very difficult for you. And at the same time, that Ninetales requires fire energies to have a gusting option. So that again limits creativity and how many decks that can actually use it as well. So that's big. Damage modifiers, Kukui and Choice Band. This means it's, these tag teams are going to be sticking around. It's much harder to one-shot these guys. So we might be going back into a two-shot style format outside of a couple of things which have unlimited damage output that can just keep going further and further based on the amount of energies and stuff that are in play, etc. Speaking of energy, cheating attachments is much harder to do now. DCE and counter energy, those two sort of double unit energy sort of attaches are gone. We do have 3 CE in the format, but that's only for evolutions. Aqua Patch, Baton, EXP Share. These are all great sort of cheating item cards to maintain energies and get extra ones into play. I think this will be most felt by the likes of Quagnag, especially because it's both at once that go, which is really awkward for these water decks. And Kiawe. Obviously we have Welder, so it's not the end of the world that Kiawe is rotating, but it's definitely a card that Reshizard is currently using. So, pre-rotation. Now, this is still very, very early in Unbroken Bonds meta. So, the decks you're seeing on here are decks that have done recently well at regional and special events that we've so far had in Unbroken Bonds. Again, this is just what's currently performing well. There may be new decks and stuff coming out of Unbroken Bonds as that format develops, but there's only really the NAIC left and a couple other big tournaments over the next few weeks, so we really have a small format of just Unbroken Bonds. It's just a few cups and whatnot, and then suddenly it's Worlds with rotation. So these are the decks that so far have done pretty well in tournaments, and we'll be discussing the ones that remain, and essentially, more importantly, the ones that are crossed out, why I think they will not be surviving the rotation. That's the real thing here. So Zapdos Beasts, Zapdos Jolteon, Zapdos... and Zoroark variants are the first ones I'll tackle. The Zapdos builds, well, losing Guzma is huge. Zapdos is an early pressure deck that needs to move its own Zapdos out of the active all the time because it needs to have the extra damage output from Thunderous Assault to be doing more than 10 base damage. So Guzmaing off, lots of evolving Pokemon was the name of the game for Zapdos, and losing essentially 4 switching cards in the deck already is very painful. You also lose Escape Rope, so the amount of times you can Stellar Wish is a lot less. So you're getting a lot less hand advantage and accumulating less cards towards big knockouts. At the same time, losing Tapu Koko GX was one of the biggest answers to these tag teams that are running riot around the format. So losing a lot of damage output in one big burst, as well as losing all this gusting for the easy prizes, makes me believe that Zapdos is probably going to be dead. Zoroark, of course, rotates on his own, so that's obvious. Weezing, I believe, will no longer be a performer. You lose counter energy and double colorless energy, being left with only the likes of counter gain options with basic energy cards, or the 3 CEs, I believe, is not reliable enough, especially when you're a spreading archetype and you're probably going to need a replacement energy every single turn because these Weezings will be going down turn by turn. I think it's no longer that viable. Wallstall, as mentioned, with all those controlling cards, mainly the healing cards leaving, I think that won't be much of an option anymore. Pikarom, Shedinja, Malamar, they all seem to be okay, and they'll be adapting, but still be alive. Quagnag is an interesting one. The Quagsire and the Ganadel are still in format, but losing Nest Ball, Ultra Ball, losing Aqua Patch, and Wishful Baton, this is the lifeblood of the deck. And building up to, Magikarp and Wailord or Buzzmosa turns will be very difficult now that you don't have that same energy retention and energy recovery all at once. So I think you will be bleeding too many energy cards in the first place for Quagnag to be that much of a strong archetype. And at the same time, we all know how clunky it already is, and that's with, 4 amazing Ultra Balls and 4 amazing Nest Balls. And without those, Quagnag will be much, much clunkier. Blacephalon seems fine. It loses basically the bare minimum, just like Ultra Ball, Marshadow, and Guzma, so that's fine. Non-GX Blounds, I think, is already a volatile deck that isn't the most consistent out there. So losing just Baton and Nest Ball is probably enough for this deck to be weak. Nidoqueen, interestingly enough, does lose a lot. It loses all its ball search, but I believe it might still be able to survive thanks to the powerful abilities that all these things boast as soon as they get into play. Gramble loses Oranguru as well as Ultra Ball, so the main means of refilling your hand as well as discarding your hand in the first place, those are no longer viable. Vikavolt, I believe, is very poor. I think, again, just going back to the lack of ball search, we're basically left with Pokecom and Lure Ball and stuff for this Vikavolt. Obviously, the Lure Ball's fantastic for those Charger bugs, but when you have to start spending them on physically getting Vikavolts back all the time, that's really awkward. I think the biggest issue is that, you lose those initial ball search cards to get the Vikavolt in the first place. You don't have a good amount of Grubbins on the board early, you can be in trouble. So I think Vikavolt's probably going to struggle. And Greninja and Zoroark, this did well at one of the smaller events. I think it was the first week of Unbroken Bonds, so obviously it's not going to be doing that great in Unbroken Bonds as a whole, I don't think. It's more of a rogue archetype currently, but I put it on here just because there is a lot of dark support to look at from Unified Minds, so I thought it was worth discussing in the future. So, speaking of which, these are some of the most impactful cards, I believe, from Unified Minds. I've kind of collated the ones from the 3 Japanese sets, and we'll sort of just briefly talk about them. Obviously, this isn't like a set review or anything like that. This is still very early days in my theorying around Worlds, so take this with a pinch of salt. But for now, I believe this is some of the most impactful cards coming out in our World set. So, on the far left, you can see Reset Stamp. This is obviously going to be a big card. It can force your opponent to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw the amount of cards equal to the amount of prizes they have left. So this can punish aggressive archetypes, and it makes you think twice about going to take prizes if your board isn't ready for, maybe if your opponent reset stamps with a counter knockout on your main attacker, you could be left with nothing else. So this reset stamp might incentivize us to have draw engines or have decks that will sort of still have game on board, even if their hand isn't always, if you can play without a hand the next turn and still win the game, that's going to be amazing. So looking at decks that have a way to stamp proof themselves with having draw, or by having, something like Malamar, where they'll have 3 Malamars in play, even if you take a knockout on the active, they can still Psychic Recharge to their next attacker and get straight back into the same spot they were last turn. Stuff like that is things to bear in mind. There's a couple new supporters, the Blue Strategy and the Hapu as well, 2 pretty cool supporter cards. I really like this Hapu. She's won me over. I think she's awesome. She's essentially an upgraded Sage's Training. She allows you to look at the top 6 cards of your deck, discard 4 and keep 2 to go into your hand. So this is really aggressive dumping of cards, which can be good for decks that want to discard in part of their strategy, as well as dig deep into the deck to find specific pieces. This Cherish Ball is pretty much the best ball search we have in the game right now. It allows you to grab a GX card, no questions asked. We have the new Weakness Guard Energy, which is essentially a weakness policy on a colorless special energy card. That Great Potion allows you to heal 50 from a GX Pokemon in the active. The Tag Switch down here is definitely a nice item card for these tag team decks. It allows you to move 2 energy cards. I believe it's from a tag team to one of your other Pokemon. It might be the other way around though, I can't remember, but the bottom line is it allows you to move 2 energies at once, either off or onto a new tag team, so something to bear in mind. Alolan Raichu and regular Raichu as a pair in a tag team also looks very cool. It can do good damage output and can paralyze, which is awkward now that Guzma and Acerola have gone. We've got this nice little package with Psyduck and Slowpoke, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. There's an Aerodactyl GX, which has an annoying ability, which is essentially Gumi's ability, but now the Aerodactyl has a much better body, it has free retreat, and it's a fighting type, so it's good against Pikarom. You also get this Fossil Lab that allows you to go ahead and search your deck for 2 things that evolve from what's called unidentified fossil and put them onto your bench. It does end your turn, but this could be good early game search for some of these fossil type cards. We have a hand-locking style approach that we can try and incorporate into some decks. Jesse and James forces both players to discard 2 cards from their hand. This is a supporter, so essentially a -3 for yourself, but you can try and choose it at a time where it's not painful for you, or when it is painful for your opponent, similar to like a delinquent style effect. You can try and aggravate this with the likes of the Weezing and Arbok as well. Over here we have a couple nice basic Pokemon. The Xurkitree is essentially a baby Buzzwole. It can do 120 if your opponent has exactly 3 prizes left, but this is a lightning type, so it's even better because you can have electro powers to increase this damage output. We have a Tapu Fini, which is essentially a hard counter to Blacephalon GX, because it is saying its second attack does 100 for the 2 waters and the colorless, but if you're up against an Ultra Beast, you can just do a single colorless attachment to do that 100, and obviously you're a water type, so you can do 200 against Blacephalon GX for 1 colorless attachment, so it's a splashable answer to Blounce. We have this Naganadel GX. I'm very hyped about this card. It's a Dragon type Ultra Beast, so great search ability with Treasure and with the Stadium card, the Ultra Space, and it allows you to discard an Ultra Beast from your hand and draw 3 cards. Amazing stage 1 draw support for us, whilst also like deck thinning the entire time. It has a nice sniping attack that can do 170. You have a psychic cost, and then you have triple acceleration to get you there, so that can help you get through Dedenes and whatnot to close out games. Its Jet's attack can also force an extra prize out from the opponent as well. It does have a lightning cost though, so it may not be all that viable. There's a big part of the Psychic package as part of Unified Minds. There's a lot of interesting Psychic-type Pokemon that we get from this set. The Mew and Mewtwo can copy a huge array of attackers, so it's going to be interesting to see how the sort of toolbox develops around this card, if at all. There's also an Espeon and Deoxys, which I don't think is all that impressive, but may end up being in Malamar. This Latias, I believe it is. Maybe Latios, I can't remember. Yeah, Latios. This has an ability that says it can't attack if there's less than 4 Pokemon in play. Sorry, on your side of the field. But it does have a tag team blocking attack, so it's a really pesky attack to get around. As well as the GX attack can flip essentially both GX markers for 1 Psychic. So if there are any decks like Pikarom, for example, that's very focused on using its GX attack to gain an advantage, you can shut that down from the opponent very early on in the game, which is pretty interesting. Jirachi has a way of stopping Psychic Pokemon having weakness, which is pretty important for some of these new Psychic tag teams, which obviously are also Psychic weak themselves. There's a Giratina Garchomp that might also see play in Malamar. It has part fighting energy cost, so it pretty much competes with Ultra Necrozma, but the fact that you can add in basic fightings might mean that you can add in some fighting type tech Pokemon, maybe like Baby Buzzwole, to help Malamar out against Pikarom, which is pretty interesting. Quick note back on this Jirachi, it also has a similar attack to Jolteon GX's GX attack. You just do 100 and your opponent can't like attack you next turn. That's really nice, especially when Guzma's rotating. We have Alolan Executor. It is weak to fire, so it's probably not going to be all that great, but it can cheat out stage 2s. One of them is a new Serena that can attach energies from your discard pile, so it's essentially a stage 2 version of Malamar. We get this big oven trainer, the Stadium card. I think this Stadium is bananas, by the way. It allows you to discard 1 from hand and go ahead and search your deck for 2 fire energies and put them into your hand. So it's like a Professor's Letter, but it's kind of on steroids, right? Because you can, if it stays in play, you can get multiple uses out of it. And at the same time, discard synergies is good for you in general. You can bin off a fire just to have usage with Fire Crystal later on. And the reason why it's so good compared to like Professor Letter is because it's specifically fire energies, which is amazing for Welder. It's amazing for synergy with Ninetales as well. If you want to have that gusting option via that stage 1 Ninetales, it can be phenomenal for you as well. It could be great with Salazzle to draw you cards as well. So this Big Oven is absolutely bananas. A fantastic Stadium card. The Heatran's a GX attacking option that can take energies for himself with his ability, similar to a Tapu Koko GX really. and his GX attack does 50. I believe it's for each fire energy attached to him. So if you are able to get lots of energies into play with like Reshizard or whatnot, take a big hit from Reshizard, then go straight into the Heatran, and then take those energies for himself and go for a big GX attack option, you can try and like protect your Reshizard that's been damaged, force the opponent to gust it up, which is limited options for people to do so, and at the same time you can do a big GX attack knockout. Dark gets a big buff. There's a new stadium that allows Dark Pokemon to have free retreat. Weavile allows you to move basic dark energies around your board, so it's like an Aromatisse, but for basic dark Pokemon only. Basic dark energy, so you can't do it with like rainbows, like Aromatisse used to do back in the day, but at the very least it can help you move around dark energy cards. The Umbreon and Darkrai does 150, and I believe it's a 60 snipe to GX Pokemon on the bench as well, so that's also a pretty interesting option. Then in the middle here we have some like miscellaneous interesting cards. Keldeo is essentially our new version of Hooper. It can be shut down by Power Plant though, which is the good news. We have Zygarde, which does damage buffing to other Zygarde Pokemon, including the Zygarde GX on its ability. And it basically is a Baby Veltol style attack. It does a fighting for 20, and you can attach a fighting energy from your discard to one of your benched. We have a Whimsical, which essentially has Le Parfum from the old Roserade. Essentially, when you evolve it, you get to search your deck for any card. Obviously, Whimsical's already got a GX card, so it might just be an addition into that deck to help you draw cards. Uxie, if you also have an Azelf and a Mesprit down, you can go ahead and get yourself ×4 weakness against your opponent. So that's a pretty nice little like mini package you can try and do. I think with Choice Band rotating, though, I think it's not very easy to have like an all-basic deck just doing like cheap energy attacks to take advantage of weakness. I think if Choice Band was around, this would be probably more viable. Then we have some interesting Stage 2s. Haxorus is a Dragon type, as is the Dragonite, so they can both be like Lance cheated out into play. They can also be cheated with like Mysterious Treasure and stuff like that. So they have good ball search, even though they are Stage 2s. The Haxorus does more damage based on the amount of fire and metal energy attached to him, and his ability helps him get there by discarding stadium cards each time to allow you to get extra attachments onto him. The Dragonite is mostly notable for the fact that he can just do 270 base damage for 5 colorless. So if you have some means of getting him out into play, again, using maybe a Lance or the other Dragonite GX from Dragon Majesty can also go ahead and help you get these Dragonites into play early. You could end up just doing big 270 damage swings, which is enough to knock out tag teams, obviously. So that could be a huge way to get up trades. The Chandelure is also a cheater. Obviously, he has the Dusk Stone to evolve up quickly. And his attack does 10 plus, I believe it's 60 more. It might be 50 more, though. I believe it's 60 more for each Pokemon in the top 5 cards of your deck that you discard off the top for your attack. And for every fire Pokemon there, you can put it onto your bench. So if you're able to go ahead and grab like Salazzles and extra Chandelures, you can go ahead and just instantly bench them. So he ends up being like a Glass Cannon type attacker, pretty risky, but at the same time, like you can end up getting a really powerful board state if you Chandelure, like more Chandelures basically is the idea. Aegislash has an ability that allows you to, when he gets knocked out, you can get back all of those cards and put them straight into your hand, other than the energy and the tools, just the Pokemon themselves, but still very helpful for maintaining. Like once you've got one Aegislash out, that's all you need, because his ability will keep like recovering himself, and his damage output is 10 for a colorless, but it can go up to 130 damage based on trainer cards in your discard pile. Actually, it's just item cards, I think. So yeah. So that was a big block of text. I hope you followed all of that. I'm sure some of you will already be familiar with some of this Unified Minds stuff, but these are kind of the most important cards, I think, from Unified Minds from what I've seen early on. I might have to look through the stuff once again. But I have taken a few good looks through this set, all 3 of these Japanese sets now. And from what I'm seeing, these are the most interesting and impactful cards. So that was a brief discussion, but that'll get you in the know, really, as we go forward and talk about the new additions to these decks and whatnot, and what's going to be changing. So here is an overview of the possible world's meta. I'm going to have a swig of water because I've been talking already way more than I thought I would have for this part of the video. So from that earlier slide, you can see on the left here the decks that I believe are surviving, decks that are currently doing well in our standard format in Unbroken Bonds, that still are strong enough to compete, and then a handful of new contenders here. Now, do bear in mind, it's still very early days for Worlds testing. I've basically been doing theory crafting rather than a lot of practice games with all these decks. So This is, like I said earlier, a long list that might end up getting a lot shorter as I start practicing and building the lists a lot better and testing them against some of the top tier decks that we have currently in our format. But this is a very broad overview of what I believe could be some of the decks that you have to be on the lookout for Worlds. So, let's start with the good stuff and how they are going to be changing. Reshizard has a few big new additions. As I said, I love Big Oven. It's an amazing stadium card, and Reshizard taking advantage of that is fantastic. It makes your welders more live throughout the game. It thins your deck of fire energies to make like Stellar Wishing stronger, or even just giving you higher outs to like Poké Gear if you want to play a greens-based build, which is absolutely phenomenal. It even means that if you want to play a like Jirachi-based build, you can add in that Ninetales to give yourself gusting options, which I think sounds very good. So Big Oven, yeah, a huge tick from me. That's going to be a phenomenal stadium card in Reshizard. Cherish Ball as well, obviously great search for this guy, and also getting you like Dedenne to draw you cards in the early turns. Heatran, a GX I've already mentioned as a GX attacking option. Tag Switch is a pretty good deal, so you can like welder onto other stuff, and then tag switch it later down the line onto new threats. Like if you switch out a damaged Reshizard, you can tag switch, attach, and then suddenly out of nowhere you can double blaze the active with a new Reshizard, which is a big threat. Reset Stamp is also a cool addition you could have yourself in the deck, especially if you play greens, right? If you play a greens exploration-based build, just having one Reset Stamp in your deck is never a bad idea, because there'll be a turn, maybe if you go behind, or at least if your opponent's trying to keep up with your Reshizard pressure, you can try and Reset Stamp them on a turn that maybe you go for a big Flare Strike or something like that, and force them to have an answer to you. There are a big few losses for Reshizard as well, though. Ultra Ball, Nest Ball, Guzma, Kiawe, Lele, Marsha, and Miltank. These are all things that are currently being played in Reshizard that are going to be out the door, which is a bit of a shame. For new threats, there aren't too many. I think the Psyduck and Slowpoke has the potential to be a bad matchup. It doesn't take much for them to one-shot you, thanks to their type coverage, and also you can't one-shot them outside of a Double Blaze for 6 energy cards, which I imagine it will be difficult for you to do so, because the Psyduck and Slowpoke can obviously one-shot you quite early, and Reset Stamp is probably the only other threat. I think that's mostly the case if you are the green space build, because you'll be limited to low hand size and you won't have much of a way back into the game. But if we are going down, Salazzle or Jirachi-based routes, you'll still have that out to Stellar Wish or try and use Salazzle to get yourself back into a good hand size to close the game out. And at the same time, a Reshizard sitting in the active, getting hit, can still use Outrage at the very worst of times, so something to bear in mind. Things it's happy to see rotate. Aqua Patch and Baton going at the same time basically means it doesn't have to worry about Quagnag, which is currently like a counter deck for Reshizard. Also, Zoroark leaving to an extent helps Reshizard out, because I think Slow King is still like a really good answer to Reshizard, but I don't see many decks just incorporating a Slow King line, because Ultra Ball's gone, and Nest Ball's gone, and Brooklet Hill's gone, so without something like Zoroark that could actually search out these combination pieces, especially alongside Triple Acceleration, don't see many decks being able to like splash in a Slow King so easily, because no one has a good enough draw engine to do so. And also, you love seeing Tapu Koko GX leave. Your Reshizard, your matchup against Pikarom is much stronger. They lose Choice Band and they lose Koko GX. That's two massive ways that they try and reach knockouts on Reshizard, so that's phenomenal for you. Overall, I think Reshizard just continues to be a top contender. Its raw stats are so good. Having Outrage, having 270 hit points, and just still having Welder, it's really easy. It's low maintenance to set up this deck because it's mainly basics, and Cherish Ball for either Reshizard or Dedenne is going to be amazing for you still. So I think both builds still have the potential to be strong. I think greens, because you can grab yourself custom catchers for gusting, as well as Reset Stamp for sort of defensive purposes, as well as like the Jirachi build, seem viable to me. Just because Jirachi can also help you pick out custom catchers. It can also help you pick out all these other pieces throughout the game. I think there's an option for the deck to go Salazzle based at last. It's kind of what I initially thought the deck would go down, but that hasn't been the case so far in Unbroken Bonds. But there's more reason for Salazzle to see play now, to have some Reset Stamp proofing, and to help you give you more of a draw engine, especially when people can't Guzma up the Salazzle so easily anymore. Committing towards this stage 1 won't be punished as easily by other decks, so you get more value out of your Salazzle in the long term. And at the same time, that stage 1 Ninetales has a potential to be pretty viable, just because there's Big Oven and there's Fire Crystals that can help you spam gusting effects, which is like something that only Fire decks can do very easily. Other decks will be limited to their custom catchers if they play them at all, so something to bear in mind. Reshizard, still great. Pikarom gains Raichu and Raichu, which is a great tag team. As mentioned earlier, that paralysis is really pesky for people to get through now that there's no Guzma and Acerola. Green's builds can play switches, obviously, and have them at guaranteed moments, but there will be times where this paralysis is just phenomenal for you. Tag switch is also crazy good. You never really have to go all in with your Pikarom anymore and full blitz onto the active. Now that you have tag switch, you can just put it to the bench knowing that you can just switch it in that opportune moment to go for that big tag bolt GX. Cherish Ball's great. Reset Stamp's also pretty reasonable. If you're playing Volkner, once again, if you have enough Volkner in your deck, you may as well just play one Reset Stamp for defensive purposes. Xurkitree is a nice one-priced Pokemon that you might want to include into the deck. Zapdos feels a lot weaker now, even though you have your Zeraora. Maybe it goes to a one Xurkitree, one Zapdos type situation rather than just having a couple of Zapdos because you don't have Guzma for those easy prizes anymore. There are a few big losses. You can't let loose the opponent. You can't Lele for your turn 1 optimal supporter. A lot of Ball Search has gone, but you do still have Cherish Ball and Radar, so I imagine that's going to be fine. Guzma obviously going is awkward. Coco GX, yeah, not fantastic either. And Choice Band means you're a lot more reliant on your E-powers and have to use them a lot more carefully. A few new threats from the new set. Zygarde, obviously the baby Zygarde, and then probably powering up a big Zygarde GX would be scary. And that Alolan Aerodactyl is also... Oh, not Alolan Aerodactyl, what am I saying? Aerodactyl GX is also awkward to deal with because it forces you to have extra energies attached, so it sort of slows down your early game, and at the same time they have that really annoying type coverage against you, which is scary for sure. Things you'll happy to see leave, a lower Muck, so you can keep on using your Dance of the Ancients, and you can keep having Thunderclap Zone live the entire time. A lot of the best fighting stuff goes, Buzzwole, Lycanroc, and Fighting Memory, these all leave, and you're happy to see Tapu Koko GX. As much as you like it in your own deck, it was also used against Pikarom very often to take big upgrades against you, so you're quite happy to see that guy go. Going forward, I think gaining this Raichu as a nice attacking option is really cool, and I think it will be used at least as a one-off in Pikarom. Pikarom will still probably be a focal point, so I think you'll still play like at least 2 Pikaroms because his energy acceleration is so crucial, but one Raichu in the deck still seems very good, just as that paralysis option. And going down an Electro, Radar, Cherish Ball, Heavy Dedenne count sounds absolutely fine to me. I think this deck will continue to draw a lot of cards with a combination of just having Volkners, Cynthias, Lilies and whatnot in the deck, as well as just like maybe even 3 Dedenne now that we lose Let Loose and we lose Lele. That sort of bench space that they would take up now can become more Dede changes just to dig deeper into the build, which I think is a nice option for the deck. There is a slight concern that Pikarom gets a lot worse against Reshizard, and that's a genuine concern that I have for the deck, because you lose Choice Band, so it's much harder to reach on them, and that Coco leaving is also a problem. So finding a way around Reshizard may be the biggest thing holding Pikarom back, but in a vacuum, the deck has like still very good search options compared to everything else out there right now. Shedinja Control is a very interesting one. It gains Hapu, which is a pretty cool supporter, actually. When the deck wants to get to a 0-card deck as quickly as possible, Hapu literally digging 6 cards deep is really nice, and it can help pick out some Pokemon cards for you to help. Basically, you're looking for Zeb Strikers and more Shedinjas the entire time, and you can bin everything else from your deck, knowing that you can resource management it back in whenever you want to. Reset Stamp is nice for, again, slowing things down. Jesse and James could be a new supporter the deck plays just to have additional discards from the opponent. It could be a way to catch people off guard and make them get rid of things they don't want to. Whilst at the same time accelerate your win condition of running them out of cards, which is essentially what you're trying to do the entire time. The biggest losses, all the Ball Search. The deck maxed out Ultra Ball, Great Ball, and Nest Ball. It just wanted to have access to as many Zeb Striker on turn 2 as it could to get galloping as quickly as possible. So losing all those is a big problem. Rescue Stretcher's a minor problem. I think you're using Brock's Grit anyway most of the time, but it is a lot more awkward to have to Brock's Grit on turns when you want to use other supporter cards. It may force you to go heavier down a Lieutenant Surge route. The new threat, really, I think, for this deck is Aerodactyl GX, just because you can't resource management very easily when there's an Aerodactyl in the active. So I think that's one thing to be concerned about for the deck. But overall, I think the biggest thing is that you love seeing Field Blower and Guzma rotate. I mean, Field Blower was the easiest answer to Shedinja, and Guzma was the other way that they sort of target your draw engine. So now you can just sort of leave Ninkadas in the active or leave Orangarus in the active in those opening turns while you're building your board, getting as many Zebras going in the back and starting to build up Shedinjas quickly. So that's a huge godsend for Shedinja, and I think it's going to end up being a slower burn and not always as rapid to get down to that 0-card deck. But I think the combination of Hapu and the fact is that your opponent can't Guzma up your Zeb Strikers as easily means you'll eventually get to that same board state and you're much more in control of the game because they won't have, Guzma for 4 prizes against you and they won't have Field Blower turns. So the lock feels more powerful and more difficult to play around for everything but Fire decks. I think Fire decks playing Ninetales have, with Fire Crystal, essentially like unlimited means of Gust. So you will really hate to see Reshizards if they add in the new not the new, but the old 9 Temptations Ninetales. If they are adding that in, it's a big problem. But if decks are just playing custom catchers, that's amazing for Shedinja control. You're only worried about 2 Gusts a game. That's like easy peasy for this deck, as long as you have a reasonable start. So really, really interesting deck, Shedinja control. I think it's a lot worse in a vacuum. Hapu does help it out a lot, though. I think that's a really nice card for the deck. Much better than Ingo and Emmet was. And at the same time, you're a lot less hard countered by stuff. So that's a really interesting thing for Shedinja. Obviously, there's still Lysander Labs. So if Shedinja is going to get all that popular, there are answers to it if you are concerned about it. So do bear that in mind. Malamar is pretty much the talk of the town post-rotation. Many people think this is going to be one of the best decks. It does gain a lot from the set, potentially. There are some interesting tag teams, the Mew and Mewtwo, the Tina Chomp. It also gains Cherish Ball to help grab some of these GXs if you are going down that route. Reset Stamp in the deck as well could be an option, as well as Hapu. Again, I'm really hyped on this supporter. I think she's phenomenal. Hapu having great advantages for helping you discard Psychic Energies early and a few other pieces and just dig deep into the deck. So you can try and find more evolution Pokemon, because essentially Malamar still loses Nest Ball and Ultra Ball. Typically it would play, 4 Ultra, 4 Treasure, and then like a number of Nest Ball. Normally it was around like 10, 11 slots total dedicated to just those cards because it was that important to get Malamars into play. Now we can only have, Fang Clubs or Elms, and then we have Cherish Balls and Mysterious Treasures. That's it. So it's a lot more difficult to get multiple Malamars going, but the counter argument is the Guzma's going. So that's amazing for you because people aren't picking off your Malamars turn by turn anymore. So your board state will stay the same as soon as you start getting Malamars in play. So that's, again, just amazing for you a lot of the time. You hate seeing Rescue Stretcher go. Using a Brock is very, very slow in Malamar, so that's definitely a concern. Also, losing Lele and Marshadow means that your treasures are a lot less versatile, and they can't get you out to draw cards anymore, which is a problem. That's kind of why I'm opting towards this Cherish Ball. Maybe if you are playing like an Ultra Malamar build, you'll play like 3 Cherish Ball just because they can help you get things like the Dene in those opening turns to get you drawing cards, as well as having nice discard synergy as well with Psych Energies, etc. For new threats, there's nothing really from the new set that I'm worried about for Malamar. Only really like the Jirachi, I guess, that can shut off things being Psychic weak. But that's just about it, I think. That's like the only problem for you. And if you're using like Tina Chomp, or if you're using Ultra Necrozma anyway, I mean, nothing has weakness to Dragons, so you're not worried about the Jirachi too much. Happy to see Rotate, Alolan Muck, so you can still use Jirachi and you can still Distortion Door the entire time. Tapu Koko promo as well, because there was like these spreading things that was really awkward for you all the time. You're really happy to see that go. Rule of Evil, Weavile, basically anything that was spreading against you, you enjoy seeing go. I think also the fact that Weezing is no longer a presence, that's one of the things keeping Malamar oppressed right now, is that Weezing has like a very, very strong Malamar. So being able to not live in fear of Weezing is good for you. Ace Eroder and Max Potion, I've kind of put those in there as happy to see rotating, just because I foresee Malamar going down 2 routes. There'll basically be this big 1 Nikio based tag team build that will play a couple of Dene and then a couple of either Tina Chomp or Ultra Malamar, whichever one comes, Ultra Necrozma, whichever one becomes the strongest. And then there'll be this heavy Giratina build that's playing spell tags everywhere. When there's no Field Blower, spell tag gets way stronger. And also when there's less Gust, being able to spell tag and Distortion Door the bench gives you some control over what's going on your opponent's side of the field. So I think the spell tag becomes a much better tool, and it becomes dangerous, to be honest. So being an all non-GX based build, being able to Distortion Door over and over again and just loop this guy is like a rinse and repeat strategy for Malamar, which we know is pretty reasonable so far. So I think that could be a direction for Malamar builds, and overall I do believe that they will be strong. Blacephalon gains, again, the potential to have Big Oven. Also the potential to have a Naga GX, which is pretty cool, actually, in the deck. Already we've seen them have like a thick Poipole count plus Ditto. Now I can definitely foresee the deck going to just like 4 Poipole plus Ditto, and then having like 4 Nagas plus Naga GX in the build. Because we have, again, less ball search, you just maximize your Pokemon counts now, I feel is like the counterbalance that you can try and do at the very least. So going for that route sounds really cool. Having Nagana Del GX giving you some option to draw cards, and again, just bin off these excess Pokemon that you're putting into your deck can be nice. It's pretty good protection around Reset Stamp, as well as helping you push a little bit deeper on your B-String turns. So that's a cool option to have. You do lose some of those standard things, Lele, Marshadow, Ultra Ball, Guzma. These are all pieces that the deck used to play. You're a little bit worried about Reset Stamp, but you're mostly worried about Tapu Fini as the new card coming in. As mentioned earlier, just a colorless energy, 100 damage on a water basic. That's a big worry for Blacephalon. The good news is Rescue Stretcher's gone, so it's not like they can just put down a Fini, attack with it, you knock it out, they attack with it, because they've stretched it back and whatnot. They can't recycle it very easily. It would have to be like a Brock into then somehow finding the Pokemon again. It's not very easy to find Pokemon in the new format, especially non-GXs. So even like little basics, they're probably just like one-use options. So that Fini could be like a 2-for-1 prize swing, but it may not just win them the game outright, for example. You are happy to see go, again, that Aqua Patch Baton. You'll happy to see those go because that basically means that Quagnag's probably dying in my books. Again, you're fairly happy to see Zoroark go now that Slowking's gone, although I already think Zoroark's not a bad matchup for you necessarily. You're happy to see Choice Band go because 180 hit points is fragile right now in a format with Choice Band, but there are a lot of cards out there that have a cap of damage that is just below 180. So your Blacephalon becomes potentially a bit more tanky, which is pretty interesting and actually quite good for you. Going forward, I think you lose pretty much the least. So Blacephalon stays intact, and it's basically down to see how strong it is against Reshizard, how strong it is against Pikarom, and how strong it is against some of these new contenders to see how well it's going to do in the new format. And if people are worried about it, there's always that Tapu Fini as well. So it may end up being... It kind of reminds me of Mega Rayquaza from like 2 years ago when we got that new Sudowoodo come out, and it was like, oh, Sudowoodo can just be an answer to Ray. And that was going into Worlds when Ray was like a, top 10 deck at the time. And then it was down to basically how many people teched against it. That's kind of how I feel Blacephalon will be. You just go into Worlds saying, man, I hope I don't see like 3 Tapu Finis day one. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble. But as we know, Blacephalon's a top contender right now in Standard. And if you're happy playing Blacephalon right now, it doesn't change too much. So that's a nice indicator for Worlds that it's going to be strong. Nidoqueen is probably the most interesting one here. I've just about said it's surviving, even though it doesn't gain anything and it loses all its ball search. The biggest reason why I think it might still be okay is that Marshadow and Guzma are going. So the only ways that Nidoqueen loses games is if you don't get set up, and Marshadow is a big reason why you don't get set up. And the other reason why you don't get set up is they Guzma your like lone Meganium, and then you're just not able to take full advantage of Quick Ripening Herb. So with these two things gone, you have a lot more time on your hands to build your board. So I'm hoping that a build with Professor Elm to get your basics out and Pokecom is enough if you thicken the lines of the Meganium, the Nidoqueen, and the Swampert to 4-4 for each of them. That's 24 Pokemon spaces. And then you just have the Coms and the Elms, the Pokegears, the Greens, and that will get you off the ground. I think it can work. Now, you are still worried about Reset Stamp, even in the late game, because you only really have like 2 power draws to try and get you into these triple accelerations. The hope is that you've thinned the deck at that point with all your power draws and whatnot to thin, so that you don't have much else left in the deck. But you're still worried about Reset Stamp, because not everything's guaranteed, and when a Nidoqueen gets knocked out, you need to like Queen's Call back stuff, and then you also have to Ripening Herb them and all that good stuff. So that's the only real concern for Nidoqueen. I think the biggest concern really is if there are Mismagius-based Reset Stamp decks, because they effectively take the role of Marshadow. If we're going to see some of these big tag team-based builds go down the route of going Mismagius, go ahead and take your first 2 prizes, and then I'll just Reset Stamp you on turn 1, then it's the same thing as the Marshadow, basically. So I think that's a concern for Nidoqueen, but really, you are much worse in a vacuum. Losing Nest Ball and losing Ultra Ball makes your early game even more fragile than it currently is, which is quite embarrassing to say, really, because it's already very fragile in those opening turns. But it can't be answered very easily at all. Once you start getting there, the deck just runs on its own. You're power drawing a bunch, your Queen's calling out to thin the deck, and you have those Meganiums basically untouched the entire game because people can't gust very easily. And it just means that you won't lose damage output, and you're pretty much good to just keep announcing Power Lariat for knockouts. So I really want to try out Nidoqueen. I'm a believer. This Meganium, it might finally be time to see the power of that quick ripening herb to the fullest extent, because when it's a bench sitter that just doesn't get knocked out, it's just going to be absolutely insane. So Nidoqueen, I'm looking out for you, even though you've lost a lot. You've lost like 12 spaces in the deck worth of ball search cards, and I'm still considering you as a deck, so that's pretty impressive stuff. Greninja and Zoroark, it's kind of just on here as like an honorable mention. I mean, it did well once, as I said earlier, it got like a top 4 in an early event in this format, so I had to put it on here for my own admission, but I mean, at the same time, I don't think it's a very strong deck at the moment. That being said, it does gain a lot. It gains that new Weavile that can move energies around. It gains Darkrai and Umbreon, which could be some relatively early game pressure for you. I mean, if you're using things like Darkrai GX and even maybe the Darkrai Prism Star to get energies rolling early, you can use that Weavile to move them all onto the tag team that's right at the good time. Darkrai and Umbreon doing 150 to the active and 60 to the bench can set things up for the late game where you have enough energies in play to just start swinging with Greninja and Zoroark to just take a chain of knockouts. That's the kind of idea here. The biggest losses, all the ball search stuff, Lele and Marshadow, and energy retention cards like Baton and EXP Share would be pretty nice. Maybe we'll still play Nagas anyway, and still have that sort of energy acceleration via stage 1s, but not quite as easy now that we have worse ball search. A lot of the fighting stuff is going, which is great for you, but there is the addition of Aerodactyl and Zygarde, so that's a slight concern. But I think you're happy to see Tapu Koko go for sure, because that's an easy answer that Zapdos and Pikarom could have to your board, because you need that for your own damage output. You're happy to see Kiawe go, because it hopefully makes Reshizard a little bit slower and gives you more time to build energies. So I think you're still a little bit weak to tag teams, but with Choice Band going and with like Kukui going, it's a lot less easy for them to take one-shots on your Ninja Zoro. And at the same time, you're an archetype that once you have those energies in play, you're basically reset stamp proof, because your damage output just doesn't go anywhere. If they take a knockout, you lose like 60 damage, basically. And even then, you can like Naga that energy back into play and Weavile it back onto your board. So I want to test out Greninja and Zoroark all over again. It may be a little bit clunky trying to play Nagas and Weavile and a number of different Ultra Beasts. Not Ultra Beasts, what am I talking about? Tag teams. But I feel like your board state will just get to a point where it's very, very strong. Once again, where there's not much gust, your Nagas will be free to just charge up every single turn, pretty much. And that all sounds great. So it's a throwback to Aromatisse. So I'm interested, and I want to see how Greninja and Zoroark will perform at Worlds. So, on to the new contenders now. For the new stuff, I'm just going to be talking about strengths and weaknesses and basically give you my overview of how I picture them in a very broad sense of how they'll be playing. So for strengths, obviously a draw engine is something that this deck has been yearning for the entire time. The biggest selling point really is that you have this draw power from the Naga GX, the new one that we're getting, as well as having great early game search. You have 4 Ultra Space, you have 4 Mysterious Treasure, which gets you Poipole and both of your Nagas. So you have ample amounts of means to get your Pokemon into play. You have reasonable type coverage if you want to play some of these non-GX, like Sledgehammer type Pokemon. You can be, obviously Buzzwole's helpful against Pikarom. Xurkitree is just a powerful non-GX. And there's a few other ones. You can have also, of course, the Stack Attackers, which can cover your weakness to Psychic to some extent. So stuff to bear in mind. That is one of the weaknesses. Obviously, your Psychic Naganadel is probably your main attacker, just it's 1 energy the entire time. So having that weakness of Psychic is worrying, seeing as though how we think Malamar is going to continue to be strong. Your damage output isn't always that high. The 170 Snipe is obviously fantastic on the new Dragon, but the Beast Raid in general is only really doing like 120 maximum. Beast Energy can help you get to 150, but that's not a phenomenal number. and also you're pretty reliant on B-String. That's if you're going down like the stack attacker route and you want to have metal energies in there and have B-String options for like assembly GX attacks and stuff like that. I think that very much could be the case, so stuff to bear in mind, but these are kind of weaknesses of Beast Box. I think the main like strength is just that you get going every game. You're kind of like the new age Zoroark, really, because you have the best ball search and you have the best draw engine. So Beast Box is essentially like the new means of Zoroark. That's kind of how I foresee it. So you can draw into reset stamps to disrupt the opponent. You can draw into custom catchers to actually gust. So you have those options available. You have sniping available as well via this new dragon as well. So I think it's got the potential to be very, very strong. And essentially it just gets set up more than the rest of the decks. Whimsical's an interesting one as well. You can see there's a lot going on here. And I've actually tried Whimsical out in this current format, with Welder and Salazzle before. And it hasn't really worked out that well, but it is still my favorite way to play Whimsical currently. The biggest thing that we gain for Whimsical, funnily enough, is actually also the Big Oven Stadium card. It means that we can play Big Ovens to be a nice counter to Power Plant, whilst also helping us get Fire Energies into our hand early to give ourselves live Welders, as well as the option to Roast Reveal. Now, I've tried Whimsical out with Salazzle before, and I can foresee it doing well again, just because you have good draw power behind yourself. You already have that Toy Box GX attack to get going, and Welder obviously helps improve your energy blow. Now that we lose DCE, obviously we still have triple acceleration, but Welder seems like a good kind of pseudo placement to try and make sure your energy blows do good damage output. So I foresee this Whimsical having a relatively nice draw engine. Once you use Elm, then you go just evolve Toy Box, and suddenly, you know, you're searching out Welder, Oven, double Salazzle, my next Whimsical, and then like my Fairy Charm or something like that. That can be amazing for you. So I think the Toy Box is not to be slept on. Obviously, when it's no let loose either, only really reset stamp, which is a lot less disruptive because you're still drawing 6 cards at the end of the day. So it can force that from the opponent early, and then they don't have it as a late game option as well, which has some merit to it as well, which is great. So I think Whimsicott will get set up, and its ability is even more annoying than ever. People can't Guzma so easily, so they have to go through Fluffy Cotton a lot more, and these Fairy Charms get a lot more annoying as well, because there's no more Field Blower. So having Fairy Charm Lightning automatically gives you a pretty good Pikarom matchup. You can have Fairy Charm ability as well to be annoying against the Ultra Beast-based decks, and a few other decks out there as well. So a few very nice Fairy Charms out there to make life difficult for a handful of decks. So I have Whimsicott on the radar. I think it has the option to be good just off of Big Oven alone, which is a pretty strange thing to say, that the Fairy deck gets improved by a card for Fire types, but that's fantastic. Weaknesses, similar to Beast Box, your base output isn't all that great, you don't like seeing Power Plant, and your energy split will still be awkward. You'll play a number of Fairy and a number of Fire. There'll be times when you see them at the wrong times. You won't be able to Toy Box because you're looking at Fire Energies instead, or you are not able to find your Big Ovens and you can't Welder and whatnot. So there will be moments where that's a little bit awkward, but I think it's something that we can work around with Whimsicott, because as soon as you either get Roast Revealing or using Toy Box, you're going to start drawing cards and be in good shape. So I think this has the option to also be a decent contender. Psyduck and Slowpoke. Now, kind of seen as like the meme card of the new set, obviously just because the poster boys themselves are some pretty memey Pokemon in combination with one another. I think it actually has some hidden potential. It has the new Mermaid Call Lapras, which allows you to recycle a Misty's Request from your discard pile. So think about this card as like Weavile Execute. This was an archetype back in the Plasma format. The Plasma Weavile was able to do Vilify, which was 30 for each Pokemon you discard from your hand. Now we have this modifier for supporter cards from your hand on a 40 times basis. So if you have 4 Lapras in play and you get back 4 Misties, that's a free 160 damage that you're getting back. And that's really, really huge, especially because if you're doing it on that turn, you can then play a Misty, which can effectively get you 3 more supporters. So if you have 4 Lapras out, or a combination of Lapras and Dragonite, because you'll probably play Dragonite because you can just Misties for a Lance at some point in the game. If you can do a combination of Fast Call and Mermaid Call, you can guarantee yourself like 240 damage. And that's really good damage, obviously. That's knocking out Pikaroms. And you're also knocking out Reshizards because you're blue. So, I mean, this can knock out the opposing tag teams very, very well. And that's the main reason why I like this archetype. Its typing is strong. You can max out hitting 240 off of a 0-card hand, in theory. If you have 2 Dragonite and 2 Lapras out, or a combination of Dragonite and Lapras out in play, and you've used Misty to find enough Misties, you can be reset stamped to 0, it comes back to your turn, you go, I'll use a combination of Fast Call and Mermaid Call, get back, 4 supporters, a combination of Misties and other supporters from your deck and your hand, your deck and your discard pile. Then you can Misties on that turn. It's a -1 supporter, but it's overall a +2 to the hand, so that 160 becomes 240. So that damage output's nuts. I think the weaknesses are you have no energy acceleration, so you'll just turn attachment at a time on these water energies, which is a problem, especially if you're getting 1-hit KO'd or even 2-hit KO'd and missing a turn attachment. That can be awkward. You are tag team focused, so you're not too happy about seeing non-GXs, and the deck is going to look strange. You're going to have a very high supporter count, probably. It's going to be a combination of Psyducks, Laprases, and just like Dragonites and Dedennes as your only Pokemon, and then just a bunch of supporter cards will fill out the deck overall. So there's a lot of work to be done with Psychic and Slowpoke. It won't have a conventional deck list, but it's definitely one that I want to explore and have been exploring early on in this format. So it's potentially the tag team destroyer archetype that might sneak up on people at Worlds, even though it looks like an absolute meme. Zygarde's one of our last here. It has that really pesky GX attack, Verdict. Even more annoying to get around now that there's no more Guzma. Its typing still good for Pikarom. Its pressure could be early game if you have enough Zygardes that you find early and start using that energy accelerating attack, basically like a baby Veltol style attack to start powering up the Zygardes. The problem is we lose DCE, so its attack cost is still going to be slow and difficult. You're probably going to have like a thick Hapu line. Once again, going back to that Hapu. You're trying to bin off as many energies as possible. You'll start off using a baby Zygarde, get some energies on the Zygarde GX, then you'll go into Cell Connector, will get you even more energies from your discard pile, and then suddenly you're using Landsrath and Verdict. The problem is, the damage output is still relatively mediocre. Landsrath doing 130, Verdict doing 150, that's not fantastic. You're going to need the scaling from these non-GXs, and it's down to you to find them in the first place, which is the biggest issue for Zygarde, so definitely something to bear in mind. Rotom is a pretty interesting one. I've always had an eye out for Rotom, and this is once again a deck that can take advantage of Hapu. I'm really putting my stake in the ground and saying this supporter is phenomenal. I really think there's a lot of avenues that decks can go down to try and use her to the fullest extent. It's a non-GX focus. It's got good type coverage. Rotom obviously being good for like the Mewtwo and like the Deoxys and Espeon and stuff like that. So that type coverage is nice. You have Frost Rotom for Reshizard as well. So that's 2 very nice typings if you want to have them. You're also relatively stamp proof because as soon as you get 9 tools in your discard pile, Rotomotor is always live, so you can just promote a new Rotom and keep using Plasma Slice, which is always an option for you. For weaknesses, the early game is going to be difficult, even with like Hapu and Adventure Bags to find your Metal Core barriers. By the way, they discard themselves at the end of the turn, so that's like the main way that you're going to try and get tools in your discard pile early. The setup's going to be difficult, and it's going to be reliant on how many Hapus you can find, how many Dedennes you can pull off in those early turns to get you towards this Rotomotor ability as quickly as possible. Also, the Plasma Slice only does 120, I say in air quotes. 120 isn't enough to knock out most tag teams in 2 hits other than Pikarom. So you're going to need help from things like Spell Tag to push you over the line. And if you're just 2-shotting, people can again just retreat out, and it's down to you to try and find double custom catcher and stuff, which isn't always easy for a deck that doesn't have a great draw engine. Previous renditions of Rotom played heavy Oranguru and heavy Let Loose, and that's no longer an option for this deck. You'll probably have to play some element of Dedenne in here if you want to draw enough cards. So that's something that's a bit of a worry for Rotom. Even though you're predominantly non-GX, you will have those Dedennes in the deck, and that can be picked off on from your opponent, and it can help them in their prize race. So something to bear in mind, but definitely one I want to try out because I've always had a bit of a soft spot for this archetype. Gengar and Omastar is a pretty interesting one. It's probably the best looking disruption deck we have available right now. Combining item lock with like the option of Horror House and Poltergeist sounds very awkward to deal with. It feels like with a lot of Ball Search leaving, we'll be having thicker counts of supporter cards in our decks. These are cards that your opponent can't instantly play down from their hand, which does help out the Poltergeist. Also, there still will be, lots of Poker Gears being played, lots of Cherish Balls, lots of Tool cards being played still as well. So Poltergeist still can get the job done. Obviously, there's no more Zoroark anymore, so you become a lot more tanky as a tag team, which is, again, great for you. So that could be nice, especially in combination with Green's Exploration, getting like mixed herbs or the Great Potion, try and spam that for some healing. It could be pretty cool. I think the issues are Poltergeist is never guaranteed damage output. You are tag team focused, and there's also not much draw engine because you want to have a limited bench size so your Omastar is live with that Fossil Bind ability. So I think that could be the biggest drawback for this deck. And finally, we have Salazzle Hand. It's, again, one of these pet decks that I like to play around with. You no longer have to live in fear of Zoroark, which was having always Judge and Palpad in the deck. So it had multiple ways of reducing your hand size very, very easily. But that sort of fear of both Let Loose and, of course, the Judge Palpad combinations is now you're worried about the amount of Reset Stamp decks we'll be playing. Now, overall, I don't think every deck will be playing Reset Stamp, but the ones that will, you know, sometimes it will just be like Pikarom playing 1 because they have Volkner. Sometimes it'll be Reshizard playing 1 because they have Greens. But sometimes, if you're a very defensive deck like the Naganadel Beast Box, you might be playing 2 or 3. And if that's the case, it's very worrying for Salazzle Hand. So I think the strengths lie with this deck being that you can just draw a bunch of cards, and it doesn't matter what your opponent's playing. Your game plan is the same. Your matchup spread doesn't matter. You can go into Worlds just saying, hey, I'm going to try and get a big hand size. What are you going to do about it? Well, how many Reset Stamps are you playing? That's basically the question you're posing your opponent every time. And if the answer's not enough, then you're going to be able to get to that 35 card hand before they take 6 prizes most of the time. And that's going to be your win condition. The issues for this deck, of course, it also loses Ultra Ball. That was a 4 in the deck. It lost Nest Ball as well. So, again, you might end up going down like a Hapu type route to try and dig out these Salazzles as quickly as possible. You'll still play Elm. You might still have Fan Club as well in the deck if you really want to. But these are all options for that archetype. And essentially, you may end up being slower in those initial turns. But again, with people having less answers and less shuffle draw against you, you may just have a clear path to build that big hand size. So definitely one to bear in mind. This has been a pretty long video. A lot of thought has gone into this. Obviously, it is still early days for Worlds, and I will stress that it is mainly theory here. But this has been a great video, I think. Talked a lot about rotation, got that crossed off. Also had sort of like my first look for Worlds, so hopefully that really sets the ball rolling for future deck discussions and lists that I will be doing. It will be a bit of a break until I go through these decks for Worlds. I'm going to be testing in the background and nailing out some lists with some friends and really get that ball rolling over the next few weeks when I have time. But there's still lots of stuff in Standard going on. There's still the NAIC that we have to come. There's still like Origins events, and there's still a regionals over in Sweden. So there's plenty of things to be discussing from the current format. So I will be jumping back to regular Unbroken Bond Standard for a little bit. But once the NAIC is dealt with, we will jump straight back to this post-rotation Worlds meta and be talking about lists in more detail. Hopefully by that point, I will be a lot more on the money about the 60-card lists and have some more evidence behind them as well. So hope you all enjoyed, guys. This has been a long video. My voice has died about 3 times. Apologies for having to take swigs of water throughout. And I have been trying to talk quickly. So if I've made any stumbles here and there, I hope you can excuse that. Let me know if there are any decks that you expect or want to try out for Worlds. Was there any on this list that you didn't think about that you're now going to look at twice? I'd love to hear it all down below. Get involved in the discussion. This is just going to be the first of a lot of decks to discuss about Worlds because there's so much to cover. There's a whole bunch of cards rotating at the same time. A fresh new, batch of like 140 or so cards are all coming out at once as well. So a big, big change in the game. It's a completely new way to play Pokemon. Very exciting times. So I'm sure everyone can weigh in and get involved down below. If you did like this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you've made it all the way to the end, thanks so much for the support, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.